Good afternoon. Welcome to our presentation by the Mariners Museum on Dorie Miller as we celebrate Black History Month in the month of February. I'm very privileged to bring you this presentation because Dorie is one of my childhood heroes. I was a child when the movie Tora, Tora, Tora came out. And after seeing that movie, I said, who is that guy? I want to know about that guy. Did a little research on Dorie, found out he was a World War II hero and a high school sports star, and he checked all the boxes for me. I said, I want to be like that guy when I get older. So, Dorie Miller, we're going to talk about the hero of Pearl Harbor, who unfortunately was later killed in the war by the Japanese. But we'll start with his birth, October 19th, 1919. His name is Doris. The midwife who helped deliver him was absolutely sure that his mother Henrietta was going to have a girl. There were already two boys in the family. So she named him Doris before he was even born. The name Doris is Greek. It means gift of the sea. And it was in Greek mythology, the daughter of two of the gods who became a sea nymph. So he is a young man with a girl's name. One reason why his shipmates called him Dorie. So we will refer to Doris as Dorie during our presentation. He grows up in Waco, Texas. Grows to be, by the time he started high school, 6'3" and 235 pounds. He is a very, very large young man. High school baseball star, high school football star, played left-handed pitcher and fullback. And he grew up on the farm that his parents were sharecroppers for. So Dorie is the son of sharecroppers and the grandson of slaves. They lived on a cotton farm that they worked on, and they also raised for their own additional income, hogs, cows, goats, grew some corn and grew some beans. They also hunted for additional meat. So Dorie was an excellent marksman, hunted with a .22 rifle. And while he was in high school, he took a taxidermy course, thinking he might be a taxidermist someday, which he passed. But then he decided that what he really wanted to be was a cook. So he actually dropped out of his senior year of high school to become a cook at a restaurant in Waco. He tried to join the army, but he was underage and his father wouldn't sign the papers. So he finishes working as a cook for about a year and a half, and then he joins the Navy. When he joins the Navy, he is sent to Norfolk. He did his basic training here, 12 weeks of training in Norfolk. He was originally assigned to be on the ammunition ship Pierrot. While in Norfolk, he was in a segregated barracks. That was still the norm then. And at this time in history, the Navy sailors could only work as messmen, third class, second class, or first class. So he starts as a messman third class, which means he's cooking and cleaning in the mess. But he was a very hardworking young man, and he made extra money from the Navy by also volunteering to work in the laundry, and also was assigned the job of waking up officers for their duty. Initially, he would wake them up by jostling them, and then he was informed an enlisted man cannot touch an officer, so then he would yell into their ear. And everybody knew when Dorie was in your ear, it was time to go to work. After being on the Pierrot, he was assigned to the West Virginia. And here is a photo of the West Virginia after she was repaired after Pearl Harbor. The West Virginia, after being heavily damaged at Pearl Harbor, was repaired to the point that she was able to participate in the surrender in Tokyo Bay. So this is the post refurbishing. Originally, she looked like this. There's a photo of the West Virginia in the James River, and she's in the James River because she was built right here in Newport News shipyard. Many of the battleships that were in Pearl Harbor were actually built here in Newport News. So here is a photograph from World War I. She's commissioned and sailing by 1920. This is Newport News shipyard, 1918. Some of the men that you see in this photograph underneath the ship may be related to, might be your ancestors. West Virginia was a Tennessee-class warship. Here she is leaving Newport News Shipyard after construction. Here she is finished at Newport News Shipyard in the James River. You can see these World War I battleships look a little bit like older battleships from the 1800s. Technology hadn't changed a whole lot yet. The battleships at the time were a little bit ponderous, a little bit slow. Most of the battleships that were destroyed at Pearl Harbor were actually built during this time period. So to some degree, they were World War I battleships. So to some degree, they were the Japanese did the U.S. a favor by destroying their old weaponry and forcing the U.S. to catch up. December 7th, 1941. This is the West Virginia next to Tennessee in the middle of your photograph here. This is taken by a Japanese reconnaissance plane. West Virginia sinking during the Battle of Pearl Harbor. It's hard to see, but there are actually people in the water, and these men are rescuing people in the water. So now we get to Dorie Miller's heroism. If you've seen the movie Midway, if you've seen the movie Pearl Harbor, if you've seen the movie Tora, 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 you know who Dorie Miller is. He is the young black male who leaves his post to help fight the Japanese from a gun he was untrained to use. Dorie was in the mess when the West Virginia was hit by the first of 9 torpedoes and 3 bombs. He immediately went to the bridge to see if he could help out there, and he was involved with trying to save the life of his captain, Captain Banyan, which is depicted in various films. Captain Banyan's entire midsection was split open by shrapnel from the Tennessee. They were not able to save his life. He did die on the ship. So Dorie, despite having no training in using gunnery, then went looking to see what he could do. He went down to what they called Times Square. The Times Square of the ships were the passageways that went from fore and aft and also bow to stern, because that's where all the action was. One of the lieutenants saw him and said, this is who I need. I need a very large, strong man to help. So he recruited him to again try to save the captain's life by getting him onto a stretcher. That didn't work. So Dorie then went out to man the 50 caliber machine guns to fight the Japanese. Now, he had never been trained on the gun. He had been trained to pass ammunition to the gun. But because he had grown up hunting and was a very good hunter, he had a pretty good idea of how to shoot at a moving target. So Dorie is the singular black man who is on the West Virginia gunnery deck firing away at the Japanese planes. Only 29 of the 353 Japanese planes were destroyed during this battle, and some of them actually ran out of gas going back to the carriers. So they had very, very little success. And every battleship that was in the harbor that was involved in the shooting wanted to claim that they had shot down the planes. So we do not know even to this day exactly how many planes, if any, Dorie Miller shot down. Some people said he shot down 1, some 2. Some said he shot down as many as 4 to 6. We only know for sure that the West Virginia was credited with at least 1 kill from its gun deck. So he may or might not have hit his targets. Initially, he said, I may have gotten 1. He said, I may have gotten 2. He was never sure. When he was talking to his friends, after a few drinks, he might say as many as 4. The lieutenants and the captains who made the after battle reports said it might have been as many as 2. But the most significant part of the story is that a man who was untrained, who was not allowed by Navy rules, who was not allowed by the segregation of the day and by the Navy laws of the day to even be operating this gun, went to help his country and went to fire a gun he was unfamiliar with. Pearl Harbor ends, and the report goes to Congress on what happened there. And the report included an unnamed black man fired a 50 caliber machine gun. This was in the official report that was then given to the public. An unnamed, an unidentified black man. This was part of the prejudice of the day. So the black newspapers of the time, which were extremely influential during this time period in history, got on the case to find out who this unnamed man was. And the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the best black newspaper in history, great newspaper, and had a circulation of as much as 200,000 in its heyday. It was published for over 100 years. Pittsburgh Courier did some digging, was able to get some people in Congress who knew the name. And months after the battle, the Pittsburgh Courier names him. His name was Doris Miller. He's from Waco, Texas. But before he was even named, when the original story of the unidentified black man came out in the newspapers, his mother, Henrietta, said, "I know that was Doris." And she was right. Here are Connery and Henrietta Miller. This photo was taken in 1942. These are his parents. She ended up having 4 boys. Dorie is the third of the 4 boys. This is the farm that they worked on. This farm has been destroyed by the damming of the Bosque River. After the river was dammed, they then moved into Waco proper, and their house was burned down in 1957. And with that fire went all of Dorie's medals and all of his paperwork and correspondence. So most of what we know about Dorie Miller, we know from newspaper interviews and from things he told his brothers and he told his shipmates. So with him now becoming very quickly famous, he now becomes a public figure. And Dorie Miller, December 7th, 1941, remember, he becomes a household name. Dorie now makes the transition of the greatest black heroes in the century. He comes after Jesse Owens and Joe Louis, and he comes just before Jackie Robinson. But since Joe Louis's career was mostly done by this time, within a year, he surpasses Joe Louis as the greatest black hero in American culture. And people write songs about him, and people write poetry about him. I would like to read a couple of these. This is from Gwendolyn Brooks, great poet. And the title of her poem was Negro Hero. This is about Dorie. And of course, my blood was boiling about in my head and straining and howling and singing me on. Of course, I was rolled on wheels of my boy itch to get at the gun. Of course, all the delicate rehearsal shots of my childhood masked and mirage before me. Of course, I was child. And my first swallow of the liquor of battle, bleeding black, air dying and demon noise made me wild. Here is a song that was played in the jazz clubs called "Oh, What a Time." The author has been lost to history, but there were dozens and dozens of songs written about Dorie. And of course, jazz was the predominant form of music at this time. In 1941, a colored mess boy manned the gun. Although he had never been trained, had the nerves ever seen, God willing and mother writ, going to be called the great Dorie Miller yet. Grabbed a gun and took dead aim, Japanese bombers into fiery flame. He was aiming the Japs to fight, fought at the polls to make things right. Fight on, Dorie Miller, I know you tried, did your best for the side. I love Dorie Miller because he's my race. And here is a beautiful poem written by Belle Bankin. This was actually written at the German surrender in 1945. And it was printed by the US Army, published by the US Army, and sent to the troops in occupied Germany. It's called Epitaph to My Son, because Belle Bankin's son had died in the war. I, Dorie Miller, brown-skinned and eyed, my heritage that of the Robesons, the Carvers, the Douglases, my forebears, the once proud citizens of a proud Africa. I, Dorie Miller, laid down my life, fighting the lynch laws that threatened all mankind. Now that my job is done, are you with me, brother? I manned a gun that was not meant for hands like mine. For liberty is dearly bought, and once man struggles for it, it's his who pays the bitter price. My people are richer by those moments of battle. Their march is ahead, their destiny inevitable. As you can tell by this poem, Dorie Miller brought about a newspaper war against the United States Navy, trying to get full integration of black and white sailors on the ships. Now, that full integration did not happen until under President Truman during the Korean War, but he became a spokesman, he became a symbol, as did his parents. His parents spent the rest of their lives being interviewed about not only Dorie and his contribution to the war effort, but also about integration and civil rights and equality. Here's Cuba Gooding Jr. as Doris Miller in Pearl Harbor. Dorie, as portrayed by Cuba, was also a heavyweight boxing champion. But in the movie, he's displayed as winning that boxing championship at Pearl Harbor. He actually won it right here in Norfolk. He became the heavyweight champion of the squadron. He thought that after the war, he might become a professional boxer. He was a heavyweight. Heavyweights back then were in the 200-pound range. They didn't become very large like now. He was a very, very good boxer, very technically excellent, and a very hard fighter. Now, Cuba Gooding's version followed Alvin Havard's version in Tora, Tora, Tora. And Alvin Havard is still alive. He's 82 years old. He went on after the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. When he portrayed Dorie, he portrayed many policemen and military soldiers in various movies and TV shows. So Dorie has been named now. So the U.S. Navy has to pay attention. They tried to hide his identity because they didn't want to make a big deal about integration and putting black men on guns. But once it became public and he was a folk hero, they had to respond. This is Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander SINCPAC. That's the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. He is putting the Navy Cross on Dorie Miller on the deck of the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier. Dorie becomes the first black man in history to win the Navy Cross. As Chester Nimitz is placing this cross on Dorie, and you can see from this photograph how large of a man Dorie is. When he was first in the Navy, he had to wear his own shoes because the Navy didn't have any shoes big enough for him. They had to have special shoes made for him. The Navy Cross citation reads, "For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii, by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941, while at the side of his captain on the bridge, Miller, despite enemy strafing and bombing and in the face of a serious fire, assisted in moving his captain, who had been mortally wounded, to a place of greater safety, and later manned and operated a machine gun directed at enemy Japanese attacking aircraft until ordered to leave the bridge." And he was ordered to leave the bridge. And what did he do next? He saved dozens of men in the water. Dorie's next act of heroism, he's always depicted in the movie as firing the gun, but his next act of heroism was rescuing people and pulling them out of the water. They couldn't get off the deck of the ship initially as it was sinking and fires were everywhere. So he was thrown a line and then he climbed on the rope, and then hand over hand, he and two other officers were able to get off of the bridge onto the deck, where they were then able to rescue men that were wounded and in the water and pulling them out. He then was one of the last 3 men to leave the West Virginia as it sank, along with 2 officers, and they had nowhere to go. So Dorie then swam 400 yards through the burning water onto Ford's Island to his safety. And when he was asked about the swim, he said, "God was looking after me." And he also said in a later interview, "God and my mother were looking after me." So this is not depicted in the movies, but one of the last 3 men to leave the ship. Overall, during his career, he won the Navy Cross, Purple Heart posthumously, Combat Action Ribbon posthumously, Good Conduct Medal, American Defense Service Medal with Fleet Crest, Bronze Star, American Campaign Medal, Asian Pacific Campaign Medal with 2 Bronze Stars, World War II Victory Medal also posthumously. He is assigned to the Indianapolis. He spends 15 months on the Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser. And the public is clamoring to see Dorie. The Indianapolis is sailing all around the world. It's being involved in the war. And the public says, you have white men who have fought, became heroes, who are now traveling in the United States, making speeches and selling war bonds. Why can't Dorie do the same? The Navy finally relented. When the Indianapolis returned to Pearl Harbor after months at sea, they then flew him back to the United States. And Dorie's next career as a spokesman for the Navy and as an instructor for Navy recruits begins. Here he is at the first graduating class from Camp Robert Smalls in Great Lakes Traveling Station, making a speech to the cadets. Because of Dorie Miller's heroism at Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy creates a new program and begins it at Camp Robert Smalls in order to train Black men to be naval officers. This particular camp graduated their first 13 people, of which Dorie was one of the instructors and one of the people working with the young men. And those 13 became known as the Golden 13. So as you can see, Dorie's putting on a little bit of weight now as he travels. Here's Dorie again, sitting in the front, talking to some of the recruits and a civilian. Now, because segregation is still the order of the day, Camp Robert Smalls was a segregated training camp. And now graduation with some of the first group. This is Lieutenant Commander Armstrong presenting his certificate of graduation from Camp Robert Smalls to George Clinton Fields, who was the personal valet for many, many years to President Franklin Roosevelt. Any movie that you see in which Roosevelt is depicted, George is always there. The president always refers to him as George. He's a character you cannot leave out of the movies because he was constantly at the president's side, except of course when he went to do some naval training. So this is what George Clinton Fields looked like in real life. In the movies, he's always depicted as being much heavier, much older. And here is George Clinton Fields with a certificate of graduation as the first group to graduate from Camp Robert Smalls. That's in Chicago. Here he is on leave as he's traveling the country. You see, this is Moselle, his fiance. He ended up ending the engagement. He said, "I don't want Moselle to be a war widow." Before he went back out to sea while he was traveling in the United States, making speeches, and he spoke in places like Oakland and Dallas and San Francisco and Chicago, Montgomery, Alabama, and the height of the segregated area of the U.S., selling war bonds and recruiting young men to join the Navy. He told his younger brother, Charles, he said, "When I go back out to sea, it will be my last roundup. Either the Japanese are going to get me or a jealous shipmate is going to get me." So I actually predicted that he wasn't coming home. If he did come home, he said what he would like to do is open a nightclub and be the chef at the nightclub, or again, be a professional boxer. So he and Moselle never end up getting married. After he's taken off the Indianapolis, he's put on the escort carrier Liscombe Bay. Liscombe Bay was built in Vancouver, Washington. Liscombe Bay is what's known as an escort carrier. These were small carriers, about half the size of the larger carriers. They were called CVEs, which means carrier escort, but the sailors on board said what it actually meant was that they were combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. They were easy targets because they had very light armor compared to regular aircraft carriers, and because they were used to support the fleet, they were always carrying extra ammunition, extra fuel, and extra bombs that could be transferred to the other ships. So the Liscombe Bay then goes into combat in the Pacific, the Battle of Mackinac Island, during the campaign in the Gilbert Islands. And she's hit by a submarine torpedo, 5:10 a.m. on November 24th, 1943. She immediately explodes. The explosion was so deadly that there was steel shards from the explosion raining on the other ships from as much as 1,500 feet away. And she goes down in only 23 minutes. 591 enlisted men, 53 officers die in the sinking of the Liscombe Bay. It took until December 7th, 1943, exactly 2 years to the day, after his heroism that his parents were informed of Dorie's death. So again, he now becomes posthumously an even greater American hero because he symbolizes everything that is right about a young man, and he symbolizes everything that segregation was preventing. He was a very intelligent, very quiet man, didn't speak very often, but when he did spoke, he spoke his mind. He also was extremely diligent. This man has no skeletons in his closet, which makes him a perfect hero in many ways. He is absolutely the kind of young man that, as was put by many politicians at the time, the exact symbol of what we can be allowed to do if you just let us fire the guns and fly the airplanes and command the ships. He was trained before being put on the Liscombe Bay as a gunner, so he could actually, instead of volunteering in the middle of a battle, he could actually do it for real. And he showed to his other gunner mates what a good shot he was by shooting the targets and hitting them almost immediately. And they were always balloons that were floating in the air that they used for targets when they're out at sea. There are dozens of things named after Dorie Miller all around the United States because of his heroism. This is the dedication of the Doris Miller Monument in 1944 at his old high school, A.J. Moore High School in Waco. And on the right, we see what it looks like. Congressman Barbara Jordan, who was the first Black woman to be elected to Congress from Houston. Barbara Jordan, during her dedication at the commissioning of the USS Doris Miller frigate, says, "The Dorie Millers of the future will be captains as well as cooks. Captains as well as cooks." This is his mother, Henrietta, still alive in 1973, in Norfolk at the commissioning of the frigate Doris Miller. Doris Miller was retired and was sold to Turkey to be used as for target practice, so it's no longer with us. But of course, we now have the new Doris Miller being built at Newport New Shipyard. It is going to be a Ford-class aircraft carrier. It is going to be laid down in January of 2026, launched in October of 2029, commissioned in 2032. So a new aircraft carrier will be named after Doris Miller, so his name continue to be talked about as one of our naval heroes. Here is a depiction of the Navy Cross and its heroism. What I like about this depiction is it doesn't just include him firing the gun, it also includes him trying to save people's lives and being involved in rescue operations. He was one of 4 distinguished sailors for a 2010 stamp. He was the only one of the sailors who was not an officer of the 4 who were named. Now I'm going to go back on my slides. To Admiral Nimitz. Now, as we celebrate Black History Month, one of the important parts of Dorie's story is, of course, his impact on culture and society. When he enlisted in the Navy, it was a 6-year enlistment. And of course, he unfortunately dies within 3 years of that enlistment. His heroism is important, but his symbolism all these years later, it ultimately is more important. like to go back and talk a little bit about his childhood growing up. That section of Texas where Waco is a cotton farming section, and it was one of the strongest areas of segregation in the South. And so we grew up in a very, very segregated society. They had the four children. He grew up in a three-room sharecropper's cabin, which just had a kitchen and a living room. His parents slept in the living room, and then he had the four boys shared a bedroom. When he was growing up, he identified very, very much with service and serving other people. So what he told his mother is, I want to learn how to do everything that you do, cooking and laundry and sewing and things of that nature, so I can do whatever is necessary to help out. And of course, he also learned to hunt from his father, learned to take care of animals and learned to take care of the crops, which is why he was a natural then when he was still only 17 to go to work in a restaurant there in Waco to, as he put it, I want to learn a career and a profession to get my family out of poverty. He was they were very, very involved in their church there in Waco. And because of his size and because of his athletic ability and being a star football and baseball player, he was very well known in the community. There was really nobody who didn't know who Dorie Miller was, and that would be also in the white community. So as he was finishing his teenage years, he said, I want more for myself. I want more for my people. I want to see the world. That's why he ended up choosing the Navy instead of the Army. And on his very, very first voyage in the Navy, he was able to disembark in Cuba, Peru, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and the Philippines. He was not allowed to disembark in Australia and New Zealand. At that time, Australia and New Zealand both had laws that did not allow Black American sailors to leave their ships and come on board. So even in foreign ports, he's having to deal with the segregation of the Navy. He was very, very active with relationships on the ship. He was one of the type of person who knows everyone and tries to, which is one reason why he was chosen to wake up the officers, because everybody knew him and enjoyed being around him. He could be a bit of a storyteller when he was with people he felt comfortable with, but he was not a man who liked to party, and he was a little bit shy in public. An interesting part of our story is when Pearl Harbor was attacked at 7 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, the reason he was on the ship was because he didn't want to go ashore and waste time. He was actually off that day. This was his day off, and he was supposed to go on shore with his friends. And when his friends went on shore for their shore leave, he said, no, I'd rather stay here, do some reading, get some work in. We'd rather not go ashore. So he stays on the ship, and even though he was off, he got up at 6 a.m. and got to work, taking care of some laundry. And he had already been promoted because of his hard work from messman 3rd class to messman 2nd class, and ultimately we were promoted to 1st class. When he died, he was messman 1st class, but he was gunner 2nd class. So he was hard at work. And so when the first torpedo hits, Dorie goes above to the deck immediately to see what was going on and see how he could help out. And then was very, very visible, for lack of a better term, to the officers who were trying to figure out what was going on to save the day. He was depicted in the movies as actually talking to the captain, but the captain was actually unconscious for most of that time from his wounds. So that probably didn't happen. And part of the reason that he was helping to try to save the captain's life, and why he was asked to also do that, was because he was the biggest man on ship. And so they were trying to take advantage of his strength and ability to do that. When they realized that the captain had died and they could do no more for him, that's when he and 2 white officers then manned the guns. Dorie was actually asked to help load the guns, and he said, I know how to shoot. I'm a hunter. I got this. So he takes the 50 caliber machine gun and he fires it repeatedly until he runs completely out of ammunition. When he completely runs out of ammunition, he and the other two officers then try to figure out a way to get off the ship. And that's why later in the battle, he ends up rescuing people from the water. Now, one thing that is accurately portrayed in the movies, and I'm going to assume most of you have at least seen at least one of these three films that I mentioned, is there's so much oil in the water and so much gasoline in the water that was burning. One of the worst places to be was in the water and being engulfed in flames. And he risked his life to, as he put it, he told his mother, God's protective hands. He said, I use God's protective hands and I use God's strength that he gave me. And this is one of the things that he would say in his interviews with newspapers too. So after months of not being identified, once he's identified, he originally became very, very shy about the intention. And that's why he mentioned to his brother later on, he was afraid one of his own shipmates was going to off him. If you can imagine, he's not just the first Black man to travel the United States, making speeches to sell war bonds and to recruit people into the Navy. He's the only Black man. In fact, he was the only Black man from the Navy to do that the entire war. So he is completely one of a kind. And everywhere that he goes, and many of the cities that he went to had very large Black press operations. And back then you had newspapers that were for the Black community that were as large in circulation as the ones for the white community. And again, the Pittsburgh Courier was extremely influential. Great sports section, by the way. I'm a retired sports writer, and you look at old Pittsburgh Couriers from 50 years ago, 80 years ago, they're just fabulous. So everywhere he goes, he gives interviews to the various newspapers. There would be posters that he was coming to town. There would be the advertisements that he was coming to town. People would go in droves to where he was speaking, and then he would sit often in a chair and just talk to people for hours afterwards. And yes, sign autographs on various things. They would, as part of the fundraising, they would sell things that he could autograph. And so he is actually, during this time period, he actually replaces Joe Louis as the most admired man in America, according to surveys and according to polls. Now, Louis, as you remember, of course, beating Max Schmeling in the 1930s as one of the greatest boxers in history, and of course, what Jesse Owens did against Hitler's Olympics 36. If you can imagine a man replacing both of them in popularity and in influence. Louis actually did a couple of exhibition fights to raise money to pay for the housing and food bills for war widows. Because at this time, the government and the military were really not set up for the sheer number of widows they were going to have from World War II. So Joe Louis helped raise money doing that. And as part of what Miller was doing was not only bringing people into the Navy, but then also helping to protect widows. So he becomes a major cause. And now President Roosevelt is also involved, and he is getting, quite frankly, embarrassed by the fact that from a Navy perspective, Miller was being ignored. He's not being promoted. He's not being given training on firing guns. He's not being able to move up. When he moved up to messman first class, what that change meant was that now he was serving only officers, whereas before he would be serving the whole crew. So that puts him in a much smaller circle. But as the Pittsburgh Courier ran a cartoon showing Dorie with a mop in his hand, they said he's America's war hero, but he still is allowed to carry only a mop. And so he becomes the face of integration in the 1940s in a way that even more so than Jackie Robinson would be in 1947. So a local newspaper here in Norfolk, the Journal and Guide, wrote about this issue: "We are Americans. We are at war. So long as our service remains complete and unsullied, the cry for total emancipation is just inevitable. So he becomes the symbol of American equality, and his cause becomes an impetus to the civil rights movement, which is going to quickly follow. But during the war, he still is a sailor fighting the Japanese and doing his best to stay alive while trying to advance. Now, as I mentioned, even after becoming a hero and transferring ships and being promoted, he still would tell his brothers, when this is all over, I'm not doing a career in the Navy. I really just want to open a nightclub and be the lead chef. The nightclub, by the way, that the Black community hung out in when they were off duty in Norfolk was on Church Street. Which is now mostly doctor's offices and things. So our Navy has honored his memory, again, by planning the aircraft carrier named in his honor, but there's still something that he lacks that is still an issue in Congress and still continually comes up in Congress. And that is that he has never been awarded the Medal of Honor. There are no Black sailors from World War II that have received the Medal of Honor. And every time it comes up, it is denied. There were a total of 15 Medal of Honors awarded to the Navy as a result of Pearl Harbor. 9 of those were done posthumously because 9 of them died at Pearl Harbor. Also, 9 of the 15 were officers. But as the Black press at the time would write, those men were just doing their job that they were trained to do, the job that they were expected to do. And many of them, like Captain Banyan of the West Virginia, died very, very early in the battle and really had nothing to do with the outcome. So he is still a cause congressionally, and it's still, as recently as a couple of years ago, comes up in Congress about how to totally memorialize this man. Now, as I mentioned, there are dozens of parks and schools and streets and community centers named after him. Right here in Newport News, we have a Doris Miller Community Center. And these parks and schools are in New York and Chicago and San Francisco and Oakland and Dallas and here in Hampton Roads. They are absolutely everywhere. But because of the time difference and because the Doris Miller frigate was decommissioned back in the 90s, the name is not as well known as he should be, which is one reason why we wanted to honor him during Black History Month here at the museum. So if he's awarded the Medal of Honor, that would help push things along. But certainly this aircraft carrier that Newport News Shipyard is building will certainly change that face, because people are going to have to know who is this person, what is his story, and hopefully become a household name again. Because the people I mentioned before, of course, they were all athletes. And in our culture, we have many Black men who are heroes because of sports. But Joe Louis, again, Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, all athletes. Although Robinson did serve as a tank commander in World War II. And so here's a different kind of man, a kind of man who, when he was in danger and when the United States was under attack, took upon himself to do something he had not been trained to do, that he had not been asked to do, that he had not been expected to do. But as he put it, was the right thing. His explanation was, the Japanese were shooting at me, so I shot back. And it's as simple as explanation as any, but one that, again, for the entire rest of World War II, the Navy was not allowing their Black sailors to do. And Barbara Jordan was correct that now we have Black captains in our Navy. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, he was a hero of mine when I was a child. And one reason was because of his sacrifice and his humility afterwards. Dorie was an extremely humble man. He never even said anything that was controversial. He would actually, when he was doing a lot of these speaking engagements, he wouldn't wear his uniform. And even when he did wear his uniform, he wouldn't wear his medals. And when people would ask him where his medals were, he'd say that they're at the dry cleaners and things like that. He didn't want to call attention to himself. He wanted to call attention to the cause, but he didn't want to call attention to himself. An extremely humble man. And he is again, because his house, his childhood house is under water now, under a lake. And then the house that his parents moved into no longer exists. He's barely even known in Waco anymore, even though there are memorials to him all over Waco and a city park. So I hope you have enjoyed learning a little bit about Dorie. Does anyone have any questions or observations or comments they would like to add?
Hey, Ed. Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great one. And if you all have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. So we've got one here. Was the Indianapolis the ship that delivered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Japan?
Yes.
And later sunk by a torpedo?
Yes. She was a heavy cruiser. That is the ship. Yes. Yeah, he was. He might, if he stayed on the Indianapolis, he might have died on the Indianapolis too. That is a great question. Whether he had a premonition or whether he was getting grief from his fellow sailors. There were some, it was documented that there were some white sailors who would avoid him entirely because they couldn't stand seeing that Navy cross on him because of prejudice and racism. And whether there was jealousy among the other black sailors because they were all still messmen and still working in very, very tight quarters. We don't know, but it's possible somebody said something to him or did something during that time period that made him fear for his life. But again, when he broke up with his fiance, he actually told her, I'm not coming home and I don't want you to be a war widow. Any other questions?
No more questions at this time. We'll give people just a moment. If you have anything, go ahead and type that in. Here we go. All right, we got one. So this person said, I may have missed this earlier part of the lecture, but any knowledge on his unusual male name? And
yes, he has two older brothers. And when his mother was pregnant, there was a midwife who was helping out, and the midwife was convinced this was going to be a girl. Now, of course, there were no sonograms back then. She had no inside information, but she said, I'm convinced it's going to be a girl. And the midwife picked out the name Doris before he was even born. And since she had picked out the name, they wanted to honor him, that the name stuck. And so, as I mentioned, it is Greek. It means gift from the sea or gift of the sea. So it ended up actually being a name that was a premonition. He in fact was a gift of the sea, and then ended up dying in the sea. And it also, the original meaning in Greek is Doris was a sea nymph who was the daughter of two gods. So that's one reason he went by Dorie, is because his shipmates, he still went by Doris growing up, but when he got in the Navy, his shipmates said, I'm not calling you a girl's name, you're Dorie. So he became known as Dorie. And then during his tour of the United States, on the war bond tour, he was always went by Dorie. He didn't ever call himself that though. When he introduced himself as Doris.
All right, great. Thank you very much. It looks like that's all the questions that we have.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Again, if there are some wonderful books about him. I mentioned the movies that you might be familiar with, but there are actually a couple of movies made about him on World War II, which is still going on. And during the 1950s, some TV shows made about him. So there are other things out there, and more books continue to be written about him. Additional research. Again, he died less than 2 years after Pearl Harbor. So there's not as much information as there might have been. Thank you.